Hello and welcome to the programme. Now, since 2014, the war in Donbas has affected over 4.4 million people, of which 3.4 million are still in need of assistance. Humanitarian access is still very restricted in the non-government controlled areas. Now, today we want to take a look back at 2018 to discuss humanitarian policy in Ukraine. Now, joining us in the studio is Yuriy Ruban. He's the head of the main department for humanitarian policy of the presidential administration. Hello, thank you so much, Yuriy, for coming into our studio.
Yeah, that's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
So first of all, I'd like to ask you, as I said in the introduction, how have things changed over 2018 in terms of the humanitarian assistance, if any, there is, for people who are still living in the occupied territories? What sort of services do they have that they perhaps didn't have before?
Well, let me say in such a way that unfortunately for the people that are living on the uncontrolled territory, I mean territory that was occupied by Russian troops and Russian proxies, of course, we cannot hope for any improvement of the humanitarian situation. Well, you know, a lot of international documents, starting, for example, with the resolution of Council of Europe, United Nations resolutions, and so there is a package of documents. According to these documents, the responsibility for the humanitarian situation, or I would even say humanitarian crisis on the temporarily occupied territories, was laid on the Russian Federation, because it's the responsibility of the aggressor all this occupation, annexation of Crimea and so on. By the way, in Crimea we also can speak about some kind of humanitarian crisis. I mean, a lot of problems with violation of the human rights for Crimean Tatars, for Ukrainian people, for example, in the sphere of education. All Ukrainian, for example, schools, there were not so much of them, but all Ukrainian schools have been closed or reshaped for studying only in Russian and so on. So that's, if we're speaking about consequences of this occupation, we really speaking about violation of human rights, and so we are speaking about humanitarian crisis.
Well, these are a lot of problems. You've laid out the problems in Crimea with the Ukrainian schools, in the Donbas with people having access to pensions. But have you seen any progress in what the government has been doing, the Ukrainian government? What's their strategy? Obviously, they can't help people directly who are in the occupied territories, but perhaps for people who are crossing the de facto contact line.
Sure.
How has this changed over 2018?
First of all, let's emphasize that I would say that the point is, first of all, to help the displaced person which are on the Ukrainian territory. So I would, comparing with the situation in 2014 for 2015, I see a lot of improvements. Actually, we see I would say this, the word even integration of these people to local communities in different areas of Ukraine. Of course, the situation is a bit different. I would say that the biggest number of these people are mostly in Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Dnipropetrovsk region. Yes, in these regions. Well, we are speaking. Don't forget that we are speaking something about 1 million people,
which is incredible, really.
Yeah,
which is the biggest flow of people in Europe, almost.
Yeah, it's the biggest humanitarian problem in the whole Europe. Yes, 1 million displaced person. Officially, we are speaking about, for example, Ukrainian government supports in different forms, something like 160,000 people, including, of course, disabled persons or elder people.
And when you say support, what sort of support Is it a
different kind of support.
range?
First of all, there were, first of all, let me say, specific support in the meaning for paying for residence, paying for temporary unemployment, and so on. This is the package. Of course, I can recognize fully that, of course, there may be this is maybe not such big payments as we want, but to tell, look, I would show you the simplest example.
Okay.
Which I consider, well, more or less indicator. Yes, if we are speaking, for example, we are working. To some extent, we are supporting the St. Egidius, people. This is the humanitarian organizations. It is supported by Vatican. They are helping for people with who are looking for shelter, for these people that are living on the streets and so on. They told us that there are no displaced person in this highly people in high need. No, so it, on my opinion, is the indicator that the programs of support, or more or less, they are working. Of course, here we must by all means mention the local authorities, because all housing, all ways of putting these some homes for these people and so on. This is the responsibility of local authorities. And again, I mentioned the Kharkiv region, especially I would mention Dnipro region, Dnipropetrovsk. So that's more or less, again, these people, of course, we cannot speak about that these people are fully satisfied with all these conditions, again. But don't forget that we are speaking about the people that, for example, they take the briefcase with them with documents and 200 or 300 hryvnias, and they came with documents and often with little children in their hands. They cross the line of separation. So it's, on my opinion, it's the indicator of, let me say, some strong solidarity of Ukrainian society, and don't be so complimentary, of course, but some effectiveness of the work of Ukrainian government.
But also it's supported by the European Union as well, because
that's all.
They allocated an additional 4 million euros recently, and now their total humanitarian assistance has been 116 million euros. So that's been an incredible help since 2014.
Yeah, but here, of course, let me have some, it's only my personal reservation in this. If we are speaking, of course, this is a huge sum, and we really appreciate that by all means. That's true, and this is, again, but here we are speaking, we are speaking about different group of people. If we are speaking, of course, in the program of housing, especially in the first, I would say in 2014, in 2015, the support for temporary housing, it was really effective, and it helped a lot for a lot of people. Now we are speaking mostly about support for disabled person. This is they are mostly concentrated. They are concentrated about such issues as, for example, help in medical assistance, education for children, for women with children, and so on. And here we are speaking about the humanitarian support for also for the people that are on the uncontrolled territory. This is the support through Red Cross and other international organizations. And
also, it's very important, I would imagine, in your position, to make sure that the people who live in the occupied territory are not forgotten.
Yeah, sure. That's very, let we say, very hard consequence of occupation is the total blocking of banking system, and so it's it's impossible, for example, to support them, for example, for pensions, for any social support, and so on. So it's a really inconvenience. I guess we must recognize this. These people have to get this money on the Ukrainian side of the separation line. So of course it's inconvenient. It's a problem, but we have no other chance to support them.
And what about the flow of people who are crossing the contact line now? Has it stabilized?
Yes, more or less.
Yeah.
I guess, again, there were some, even now, there are sometimes it happens that, for example, after artillery shelling or something like this, there have been interruption of these flows for this or other side, but more or less it is, again, the problems more or less have been solved. I mean, the checking points had been let me say, arranged with all necessary equipment. It is not the situation that as it was in 2014 or 15, when on the frost, for example, or on the sun, a lot of people stood in line and so on. So now the situation is much more comfortable. But again, generally speaking, don't forget that we are speaking about really a huge humanitarian problem. So again, the existence of this line of separation, the Russian occupation of the Ukrainian territory, this is the source of the huge problems. And
one final question. We have about a minute left. What's your expectations for next year? How do you think policy will change? Will there be much of a difference, do you think, or will you just continue your work as you're doing now?
Well, of course, we can improve a bit our policy. Of course,
what's your top three things you'd like to improve?
My top one thing is the withdrawal of the Russian troops and the settlement of this situation in general. Because again, we can improve this policy or other policy. We can increase some payments or something, but again, the main problem is the Russian occupation. Only after withdrawal of Russia from Ukrainian territory, we can speak about soothing of all these wounds because of the war. We can speak about integration of these communities into Ukrainian territory, all social help needs, and so on. So, but it will be the next step after the after the withdrawal of the Russian occupation forces.
Okay, Mr. Ruban, thank you very much for coming into our studios today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
That was Yuriy Ruban. He's the head of the main department for humanitarian policy of the presidential administration. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more.